Welcome to the show, Michael Hagley, Karen Rohr, and Michael Gerling. Welcome.
Lauren, I think you might want to edit that out. It's Scott Hagley.
All right, let's try this again. All right, welcome to the show, Scott Hagley, Karen Rohr, and Michael Gerling. Hello.
Hi, Lauren. Thanks for having us.
Hi, Lauren. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Well, Karen has actually been here before. Karen, you're actually my first repeat guest. So I don't know if congratulations is in order or I'm sorry.
I feel honored. I will take it.
I'll leave that for you to make that decision. But Michael and Scott, welcome. Karen has already given kind of her backstory on a previous episode. I think that was it season 4 or 5? I'll have to look back and put it in the show notes. So if you haven't listened, Karen had a great interview herself. Go back and listen to that after you listen to this episode. But Michael and Scott, what else would you like our listeners to know about you?
Yeah. Well, it's good to be with you, Lauren. My name is Michael Gerling, and I currently work for the Presbyterian Church USA in the national offices as one of our associates for the 1001 New Worshiping Communities Movement, which is the PCUSA's church planting program. And so I get to, normally in a non-COVID world, travel the country and talk to folks who are doing some entrepreneurial and innovative work in forming new communities. These days, it's a lot of time spent on Zoom, and that's okay too.
Yeah. Thanks. Scott, how about you?
I'm a professor of missiology at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. I work really closely with Karen Rohr in our Center for Adaptive and Innovative Ministry, and also work with a Doctor of Ministry program in missional leadership at the seminary. Before coming to Pittsburgh, I was a pastor of a church of missional communities in Vancouver, British Columbia, and so very interested in understanding the nature and shape of forming new communities and adaptive ministries in the current context we find ourselves in.
Awesome. Scott, I might have to ask you afterwards, how one becomes a professor of missiology, because I find that whole realm so fascinating, but we don't have time to get into that. Well, maybe we will. We'll see. Michael and Scott, if you, again, want to just share a little bit about kind of your faith journey. And Michael, go ahead again.
Yeah, sure. So I am a product of the Presbyterian Church since childhood. What I would say is I grew up in a church that, at the time at least, was described to me by others as a country club church, which was interesting because we were not a country club family. I was the son of an auto mechanic, and my mother owned a small retail business, and so we were not country club material at all. But we went to a country club church where being a Christian really meant being nice, saying nice things, not offending anybody. And I went from that to going to an evangelical college where being a Christian meant something very, very different. And in a lot of ways, since then, my journey has been one of kind of detoxing from all of that a little bit. And I think the biggest growing edge for me in my faith journey has been learning to love the communion of the saints and to realize that being a follower of Jesus means being a part of this broad community that spans time and space, and that I have access to wisdom and a vision of faithfulness and a vision of the kingdom of God through communion with others.
That's so interesting how you describe that, being a part of the communion of saints.
Yeah.
Love it. Michael, share your story if you don't mind.
I'll turn it over to Scott to share his story.
So, Lauren, I don't know how someone becomes a missiologist. It's something my kids still, I have 2 adolescent girls. They still mercilessly mock me about my life choices that led to this place. But I'm gonna own it and live into it. So my background's in evangelicalism also, but kind of in a roundabout way. My family was Catholic growing up, went to Catholic school. My mom had a very had a conversion experience, and we were part of a kind of almost charismatic group that was in our Catholic parish. Long story, that group ended up kind of disbanding. We ended up in a Protestant church, and that was, on the fundamentalist end of evangelicalism. Went to evangelical college, university, studied theology, wanted to be a pastor, and I think that my journey as a pastor, particularly on the West Coast, was recognizing that a lot of the forms of the faith I had been shaped by and invited into had all kinds of there was all kinds of baggage, that came with it. That through my 20s, I started sort of working through, the colonial kind of assumptions of evangelism and mission and things like that. The white supremacist kind of underpinnings of a lot of our sort of social and kind of organization of our congregations and our denominations.
Yeah.
Our lack of ability to critique capitalism. I mean, all these things. So there was a lot of kind of disentangling that happened for me in my 20s, and that's sort of the roundabout way I ended up studying mission and staying in school and getting more degrees. So I'm an elder at a Presbyterian church here in Pittsburgh. Some of my connections to some evangelical communities became a little bit harder to maintain over the years, but still consider myself very formed by that tradition. I'm very interested in those intersection points between mainline and evangelical churches and expressions of the faith. So,
yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. A spiritual practice or you all might recommend others, or it's been meaningful to you?
Yeah, the one I would share is spiritual friendship. And I actually talk about this in the chapter of the book that the three of us edited together, Sustaining Grace, which we'll talk about more in a moment here.
Yeah.
But my best friend, Chris, and I, when he was living in Pittsburgh and we were actually starting and leading a new church together, part of our rhythm was to have about a 2-hour conversation once a week. He has since moved away from Pittsburgh, and we have that conversation on the phone about once a month now. And we frame that conversation around 6 big questions that starts with what is the state of your heart, and eventually moves to praying with one another. And I think having a friendship that is intentional, that is in some ways a mutual expression of spiritual direction, it is really important. It's provided me with opportunities of receiving God's grace in tangible ways by hearing someone else say good news to me, to say to me that I'm forgiven, to say to me that I'm restored, and also to give me some honest feedback from time to time. I've heard my friends say to me, I've never seen you more alive than I have right now. And I've heard him say to me, this isn't good for you.
Yeah.
And so to get that kind of feedback, I think is really important also.
Scott, I'm curious if you grew up, if you said kind of in fundamentalist evangelical circles. I certainly did, and it reminds me of accountability partners growing up. Well, you said Michael, and I'm hoping it's a more healthier version of that. But I really think that there's a benefit of that, like you said. Scott, how about for you?
So I want to maybe point to 2 that have been really have really shaped my the last year when we've all been working from home and unable to travel and things like that. One isn't going to sound like much of a spiritual practice, but it's just it's getting into regular rhythms of either walking, running, biking, like self-propelled movement by yourself through your neighborhood, when we couldn't go other places. And I just realized that those became, I've always struggled with like centering prayer exercises because my mind just, it gets on these rabbit trails. I've actually found it's more possible for me to be centered, in these kinds of practices, these kinds of daily rhythms. And so because I haven't been traveling much at all in the last year, I feel like I've been able to get into some some healthier sort of ways of dwelling in my neighborhood, and I've realized that these have become prayerful. So I discovered something about how this practice shapes my own life. It can actually take root in my own life. The second is a practice of simplicity. I'm teaching a class on capitalism this fall, and it's caused me and my wife to think through, particularly our financial decisions and how we live, and realizing how many times you have a choice between simplicity or complexity, and you're constantly pressed by the desires of consumer capitalism to move towards complexity. And there's a kind of freedom in this move towards simplicity. So it's caused us to think about some different financial decisions, some practices in our lives, how we hold on to things, how we think about possessions. And that's been really freeing. And so that's a new thing I've been kind of learning in the last couple of months.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I've really gotten into bike riding. And boy, there's an endless rabbit trail of things you can get. All helpful, but that complexity, like you said. Karen, I don't want to leave you out of this conversation completely. Anything you want to chime in on spiritual practice since you've last been on?
Sure. I mean, I think when I was last on, I talked about spiritual direction, which has been life-changing for me. But I recently started group spiritual direction as well. And so like intentionally walking with a small group of people. And it's different, but there's a similarity there. Anytime I'm resonating with what Michael talked about in terms of spiritual friendship, anytime you're with a group of people and you can name God's movement in the world and God's movement in our shared lives, it's pretty powerful. And it not to think too hard about how infrequently we take the chance to do that in the church, because that seems to be what we're here to do.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, thanks for sharing, everyone. Let's, as Michael alluded to, Michael, Karen, and Scott, trying to get everybody's names right, recently co-edited the book Sustaining Grace, Innovative Ecosystems for New Faith Communities. And when did this come out? 2020?
Yeah, it came out right in the height of the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate to get a copy of it and really enjoyed going through it. And I wanted to dive in kind of to talking about some of these themes, but first kind of share kind of about like how the book came to be.
Sure. I mean, this was a process that Scott and Michael and I kind of worked on together. And I want to say on the front end, we were really, really lucky to have the support of 1001 New Worshiping Communities, because it enabled this to be a holistic process and not like an endless email chain. So the book really came out of a group of people from all across the church: pastors, academics, judicatory leaders, national staff people, local pastors of inherited churches, local planters, artists, farmer, all kinds of folks. And the goal was to gather people together to have an honest and productive conversation about sustainability in new faith communities.
Yeah.
It's not working and we don't feel heard. How can we communicate across that divide?
Boy, I want to put a pin on that. It's not working and we don't feel heard.
And by we, I mean everybody, right? Like the judicatory leaders, the academics, the new church planners, the inherited church leaders. Nobody feels heard.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Well, let's dive in. I want to kind of walk through some quotes that I read in the book that really stuck out to me. And I don't know if you all want to kind of take turns or, responding to these, but the one line, again, Sustaining Grace comes from a mainline perspective, as I understand it, in the Presbyterian Church USA, or the PCUSA. But in the book, it's written that the mainline church needs pioneering leaders The mainline church needs pioneering leaders need the mainline church system. So basically the point is we all need one another. Kind of talk more about that. I think I'll say this, like most pioneering leaders might be like, whoa, I don't want those kind of ancient archaic systems, those traditional systems. And again, mainline traditions, mainline denominations may be like, we're afraid of new things, that new and creative and different.
Yeah, and that tension is exactly the tension that characterized our conversation. So when we gathered a group of leaders that represented different parts of the institution, academics, as Karen said, academics and judicatory leaders and pastors and church planters and some kind of a few people in between as well. I'm working with nonprofits or whatnot. And around the table, there was a sense, there was trust in the people that were there, but there was mutual distrust of the different parts of the conversation each person represented.
Wow.
And so, so that was something we sort of embodied in the actual conceptualization of the book and in the conversation. And it's one of the reasons why we landed on this metaphor of ecosystem, that any question of sustainability should not be a question that's decided by the kind of isolated congregation or isolated church planter per se, or new church leader or whatever, but rather to recognize the breadth of gifts in the church. And the fact that in this kind of unprecedented sort of time that we're living in, this new missional era or post-Christendom or whatever, or postmodern, or whatever our sort of word of the day is to describe the kind of turmoil that we're feeling about how Christianity relates to the broader society, we need all the gifts at the table. And that's true about sustainability. I think it's also true about innovation. And we are too quick to sort of cut off these connections. Now, I think the suspicion you have is absolutely right. Mainline church systems, particularly moneyed ones, think because they have money, they assume then that they know what's best. And there's all kinds of ways that can go south. Innovative kind of people that are doing things at the edges often have a well-earned suspicion of these systems and can sometimes step on toes. And so I think that we don't want to be overly idealistic, but that but we want to recognize that any way forward has to sort of recognize the full gifts of the church.
I feel like this is an important point. Michael and Karen, you want to chime in here with anything?
Yeah, one of the phrases that a mentor of mine would often said about church planting is that church planters in the church ecosystem function as the research and development arm of the church. And I've seen that play out. It's absolutely true. The whole church needs innovators. It played out during the pandemic, at least in our denomination, when all of a sudden all of our churches needed to move to some kind of digital expression of a church gathering. We had already several of our new worshiping communities in the PCUSA who had already experimented with that and done that, and were ready to teach the rest of the church how to do it well. And so that was the most recent example and most vivid example I've seen. But I've also seen our new worshiping communities need the hard-earned wisdom of churches that have sustained and been around for a long time.
Yeah.
In the church I led and started, it was a church of mostly younger folks who were figuring out what their Christianity was going to look like. As folks who grew up in maybe less healthy expressions of Christianity. But I remember several of them who were in their 30s saying, I don't want to be the matriarch or the patriarch of this church. I want my child to have grandparent figures in the faith community they're a part of. And so for us, that meant having partnerships with established churches around us who were excited to invest in us and invest in the younger adults there and to provide mentoring relationships. And so we saw that play out too, that we needed the established church, not just for financial resources, but for everything and all the parts of who they are.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I've read this, and I imagine you all have too, that millennials and younger generations tend to appreciate, the elder generations among us, and look to them as folks that we can learn from and grow with. Yet, it can be hard to foster those relationships in church, can't it? Especially when one community or one faith community is very cutting edge and new.
I think that's a really good point. And I'm thinking back to the room where, this book started as a conversation and people brought their own essays to share with the group. And we kind of talked through them and even argued about them.
Hmm.
And the thing that made it work was that people across the table were invested in deep life shared kind of ways with other people at the table, despite
Mm.
their being in a totally different position in the ecosystem. And I think what sometimes happens in church is we keep not hearing each other. And so
Hmm.
we sort of say like, I love and care about this person, but I'm not present in this relationship anyway because I don't feel heard. I don't feel like I can, like, there's even space for me to be here. So I got to go. And the church ends up like a seesaw, unbalanced. And, one
Yeah.
side is present, one side has totally left. And if we don't have that affection and care to keep us together, then we lose the productive tension, and our sort of continuum from innovative to traditional gets really shrunk down and truncated and skewed as a result. And so, and one of the things that's really needed is the mutual affection that allows us to hear each other.
Well, it's such a hard dynamic to balance, but so important. Um, I'm curious. This was another line that was in the book that really stood out to me. That it's written, the problems of sustainability are not for church planters to solve alone. And I just want to say, like, first of all, thank you. Thank you. Now, why? Because I think it's generally thought like, hey, church planner, figure it out.
Well, I think for starters, I think the expectations that we place on new worshiping communities for self-sustainability aren't sustainable expectations.
Hmm.
We have new worshiping communities in our movement that are flourishing, growing, uh, contextually appropriate expressions of church for the time and the place where they're functioning and the group of people that they are gathering and convening. Uh, and their judicatories won't charter them. And sometimes that's because they have these metrics of, uh, in one case, there's a judicatory who's saying we need 75 people who are ready to sign on to the Book of Confessions of the Presbyterian Church in
Yeah.
order for us to consider this a real Presbyterian church.
Yeah.
And we've asked them the question, how many of your established churches can even meet that mark?
Hmm.
And the reality is a lot of them can't. And so there's a lot of wrong expectations or unreasonable expectations we place on our new worshiping communities, on our church plants.
Yeah, because I'm a church nerd, recently I put together like a little spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet, just kind of crunching financial numbers. And some data I found said the average adult gives $17 a week. So a budget of 120K, which is very minimal for a church, you'd need, I think the number was 137 or 136 adults every week to make that work. And that's not even obviously including children. So if you're going to have probably 40, 50 kids, you're going to need probably a bigger budget than 120. And the numbers just kind of get really complicated.
Yeah.
I really want to ask if being self-sustainable or totally independent from need, whether it
Mm,
be financial or collaborative or whatever, from other faith communities, is even something that we should be aspiring to. Like I have real questions
wow.
about
Yeah.
churches. The goal is to not need anybody. Oh,
Yeah.
ooh, is that a gospel goal we're striving to? And we sort of say like, well, no, but I mean, how is it going to exist? And I think there
Hmm.
needs to be more imagination there because we have to believe that being faithful can exist.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think self-sustaining as a goal for, like, a plant becomes a congregation when it's self-sustaining, is actually, it undermines innovation rather than opens it up. So,
Yeah.
the what you're describing, the average adult gives $17 a week and a budget of 120,000. We have all these assumptions about what constitutes a congregation that are based on patterns of giving and living and volunteering that, were really formed hundreds of years ago in the United States. And we're not, levels of volunteerism in the United States are different than they used to be. And we can complain about that, or we can just acknowledge that people are choosing to live their lives differently than they did 50 or 60 years ago. Disposable income, people have, we're seeing the hollowing out of the middle class, and that's going to have impact for giving and things like that. And so, if we tell people, unless you have X amount of people that can give X amount of money so that we don't have to keep funding you, that actually gets in the way of thinking about it could get in the way of thinking about different ways of forming, communities. And so I think if we think of this as a problem partially of innovating or discerning and discovering kind of new ways of forming Christian community that are attentive to these new dynamics, I think we need to be willing to invest some money in it and not assume at the outset what the outcome should be. And I think that's a little bit of what we were trying to get at with the book.
Yeah, I don't say, like, from my experience, I think that's super helpful, because when the financial metric is the leading metric that you're going by, it really shapes most, if not all, of your decisions, because it has to. Like, it's just like, if the money doesn't work, this isn't going to matter. Like, it's not going to exist, literally, in some cases.
Yeah, and I want to name here that what that often means is that people in a planting role will say, I'm gonna be underpaid because this matters. This is what I'm called to do. This is what matters to
Yeah,
me.
yeah,
And individually, people make those choices. Systemically, we are burning out our innovators. We are
oh my goodness,
we are wringing
preach
people
it,
out and
preach it.
disposing of them,
Yeah,
which is not what we believe about stewardship generally. And that's part of why the ecosystem metaphor is so important, because, like, if I one kind of plant in an ecosystem, it has
yeah.
ramifications all over the ecosystem. And I think that's true in the planting world as well.
Karen, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was one of the things that really stood out to me. I think, because you wrote about this, I think, in your chapter. Um, this is one of the things I've really wrestled with in kind of faith-based innovation. Is, I feel like, I mean, I don't think it's just faith-based, but I think so often it's really the expectation is that the planter or innovator has to bear so much of the cost, and I don't think that's fair. I just don't.
It's dangerous, right? Like, there's a question
Yeah,
of faithfulness and stewardship of people. And
yeah,
I do think that particularly people who came of age during the 2008 crash, that's me, and then witnessed the
yeah,
COVID experience, having
yeah,
not built up any
yeah,
safety net and then witnessed the COVID thing, can't look at a church that treats people like this
yeah,
economically and think, oh, this is the kind of life I want to live. I mean, I see people in that generation doing mutual aid through their for-profit businesses,
yeah,
organizing things online to make sure that different restaurants aren't totally without anything during a pandemic. And then they look at the church and they're like, well, that's a really nice building you have and a nicely manicured lawn. And how does that play out in how you treat your people?
yeah, yeah. Michael, Scott, any other thoughts there? Karen, you nailed it then, I guess. You nailed it. Well, I mean, to me, this is something I think that I I wonder a lot about, just because of the challenges of the economy, like you spoke of, Karen, the realities of the cost of higher education. I think we could all agree that there's a justice aspect to it, of people of color tending to be the ones who are most often asked to be underpaid, or bivocational, whatever. Um, it's a huge issue for sure that needs a lot of work. Um, this is interesting. It kind of goes back to a theme we talked about earlier, but um, it's you all write in the book that we often fail to recognize how much our judicatories, or for our non-denominational people among us, kind of our regional assemblies or networks of churches, how much these adjudicatories need church planters whether or not their projects ever become self-sustaining. So we've kind of talked around this issue, but I mean, why again, why from like a purely economic model we might think like, hey, this is just a drain on money, on resources, on finances to continue.
Yeah, well, I think we need people who are going to be innovators in our systems. We also we need communities that are going to keep the mission of God at the front, and I think church
Yeah.
plants are well equipped to do that. I think church plants also play a prophetic role in our ecosystem of really challenging, what is our ecclesiology and what is the essence of being church.
Hmm.
I remember in the church I grew up in, one of the Sunday school lessons one day was, the church isn't really the building, the church is the people.
Mm-hmm.
And then, decades later, fast forward, and I'm planting a church, and members of that church who, taught those Sunday school lessons to me are asking me, well, when are you going to get your building? And so I think church plants challenge the assumed ecclesiology that we have, and really call us back to what is essential. And then I also think that that blesses the established church when we put the mission of God
Yeah.
in front as a church plant.
Yeah.
I remember there were folks who visited the church I had started, and they had lived in the neighborhood for a while, and came to us because we were this new thing that popped up, and it sparked their curiosity.
Yeah.
And it wasn't for them, but it started them on a spiritual journey, and they ended up at the established church a few blocks away from us that they had been walking past, for as long as they had lived there, and it was just kind of part of the scenery for them. And so I think, there's a role for church plants to play practically of just sparking curiosity in the neighborhood,
Yeah.
and the established church benefits from that as well.
I think too, most of our churches are structured around the assumption that that they are there for their neighbors and their neighborhood, and whenever they wake up on some Sunday morning and say, you know what, my life's a mess, maybe I should go to church today, that they'll know where to go and what to do. And if you're gonna plant a church, you're going to start a new faith community, and if your assumption is we're just going to like do a great thing and open our doors, and like people are going to just, if you build it, they will come, people are just going to come in because I'm so cool and we're doing such a cool thing, that does work, I think, when you do like the multi-site church planning and you bring an army of people into a neighborhood, but that's not really what we mean when we talk about new faith, new church development. And so the kind of work, the kind of practices that are necessary to create new faith communities in new places are habits and practices that a lot of our established churches have forgotten how to do, or they are afraid to do. Often, if you go back in the annals of the church far enough, there might even still be people alive that can remember doing that kind of work in an earlier era, right? But once you have an endowment, or you have a full staff that can do your ministry for you, or you have a very comfortable worship gathering of 60 people on a Sunday morning, and you don't need more to, that kind of, like, it becomes really easy to sort of lose that sense of a community that is being hosted by a neighborhood and is also hospitable to a neighborhood that is, actively discerning the shape of faithful ministry in a changing context. And so I think when church planters are doing this kind of work in a system, and they're allowed to share their stories, and they're allowed to be teachers and not just beneficiaries of the largesse of the system, I think everybody benefits.
Yeah. Michael, Karen, any other thoughts there?
The only thing I would add, I think, is that one of the things that trips up this conversation is power dynamics. Like exactly what Scott said, is allowed to be a teacher and not just a beneficiary. There's some muscle memory and this is my heritage, right? I was raised in a Presbyterian church, traditional faith community. But we really like, as church people, to be the one who is generous and gives away and hosts. And that becomes a power dynamic really, really fast if we don't think of other people, both innovators within our system and individuals who are not affiliated with church, as part of our collaborative ecosystem and not just someone who could receive something from us. We really have to be mindful of that power dynamic because we perpetuate it without even thinking about it.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. I keep coming back to my mind. Was it Michael or Scott? I can't remember which one. New churches R&D, and I was recently reading about how new or in the last few years, like businesses are just basically shoveling all their cash to their stockholders rather than reinvesting it in their businesses. And we might say from a business perspective, like obviously a new business or a business isn't expecting to turn a profit on thing every new R&D project. Obviously, if it's just constantly hitting and constant swing and misses, they want to reevaluate. But they look at I think, you know, there has to be some measure of risk in order to advance the greater good or to see what the next thing is going to be. So I appreciate the kind of the attitude of R&D. I also I think this is important to talk about too. Like, what do we mean when we mean? What do we mean when we say? Because it can mean anything from like what you said, Scott, kind of like what happens around my neck of the woods in the Denver metro, where folks come in with this launch team of like 80 people from the south, or it's somebody, parachuting into a neighborhood or whatever. It can mean different things. So one thing I did want to ask though, what do we think? Like, I've been kind of thinking about this lately. Um, I'd imagine that we're all kind of against kind of the quote unquote numbers goal as being the sole metric, whether that be attendance, finances, whatever. What should I'm trying to literally like write a paper on this right now. So maybe I might use your answers in my paper. But what should the metrics be for whether it be the church planner or the innovator or the community itself?
Yeah, I think those metrics can shift depending on the particular juncture that a new church is at. But I remember one particular church planter of ours who happened to be a student of Scott's, so some credit to Scott on this, we'll say. But this particular planter was leading a workshop with me for one of our judicatories, not too far from Pittsburgh, and she was asked about, well, if you're not going to be, counting your offering numbers and your worship attendance, what are you going to count?
Yeah.
And she really had some brilliant answers. She talked about she counts how many cups of coffee she has with people in her neighborhood.
Yeah.
She counts how many invitations she receives into homes
Yeah.
of neighbors. And so I think there are numbers that we can count that indicate the level of trust we've built in our
Yeah.
communities and the people that we're seeking to engage, and the level of embeddedness that we have in the community or the neighborhood that we're getting started in.
That's good.
And that's really good, Michael. I like that idea. Wasn't sure where this was going to go, but I also wonder if we need to go back and like have a metric for the metric in a sense. Like what purpose are metrics serving?
Yeah.
And I think we often use metrics in a kind of lazy sense to say, am I
Yeah.
successful? Am I not successful?
Yeah.
Right. And I think in any ministry endeavor, success or non-success is not an objective kind of thing, right? It has to do, I don't want to say it's not at all objective, but it has to do with one's own sense of calling
Yeah.
and one's own sense of connection with God and the story that's sort of being woven. And oftentimes we don't know if the work we're doing is a success or not. And maybe that's even the wrong binary to be working on, like faithfulness, things like that. And I think, and so if we think of metrics as ways of helping us operationalize our values or the things that we feel called to, I think they can become much healthier. So, like the counting cups of coffee is a way for the student to say, what I feel called to do is to be present in a neighborhood and be building relational bridges. And this is, if I'm not having cups of coffee, I know I'm not aligning with this thing I'm called to.
Yeah,
I think when I work sometimes with congregations going through change processes, I'll try to get them to tell failure stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so a metric could be, do we have enough failures to show that we are actually risking new things? And to name it as a failure means we've actually had to then reflect on it, right? So are we risking new things and reflecting, and just getting into that habit, I think can get congregations unstuck. And it's a metric that can help congregations say, well, the question isn't, did anybody come, or is the ministry growing? The question is, did we try something, and did we learn something? And I think, so I like Michael's framing that, like, metrics can be different for different times, different places, and even in the same community, different when we feel like we're discerning our vocation in new ways.
Yeah. Karen?
Yeah, I mean, definitely all of that. I'm thinking about the marks or the moments where I felt like I was in a community that was practicing faithfulness in some way. And it makes me think of Simone Weil, who's a very severe thinker. And I recommend her to you if you have time to like sit down and process and take a nap afterwards. She's great. But one of the things she talks about is that an attitude of prayer is cultivated by doing things that are difficult, that one is not good at, so that when God comes upon you, you have the power of attention to be present in that moment. And for me, the places I've been where I've thought, oh, this community is practicing faithfulness, it is when hard work after hard work has discouraged us, and then something holy kind of breaks through and happens. And you can feel it kind of buzzing in the air. It's very hard to quantify and hard to prepare for, because the way you prepare for it is experiencing what so often feels like failure. I mean, I like what Scott said about how many times we failed, because I do think that's part of the training for being ready for a holy moment when it shows up, because holy moments don't often show up without some kind of tension.
That's good. This is good stuff, y'all. Let me ask this. I know we're kind of running on time. Let me ask this question real quick. I'm thinking about what Scott said about risk taking, Karen, what you just added there, and about how like you need to try things to risk and fail. I think what can happen, especially in established churches, is when established churches, even a new church that's struggling financially, things get so tight, finances are so tight that there's this real risk aversion, because like we can't afford to fail, if that makes sense. And I mean, I've experienced this myself, even in established churches and a new church context. So I guess what would be the question? Like, what would be your response to that? And maybe like my thought is like, what do we need to think about as far as financial resourcing, so that there's not this kind of like, pressure to hit a home run every time?
I know that in the community I led and in other conversations I've had in the work I'm doing now, the language of experimentation, and particularly in the church that I started, where we had a lot of scientists at the universities nearby, using laboratory language was really helpful, because they understood that experiments in the laboratory don't always go as planned, but just because they don't go as planned doesn't mean there isn't something valuable to glean from it.
Yeah.
And so I think claiming that language of experimentation, of the church as a laboratory for experimentation, and really taking that seriously then, and not just trying things and moving on if they don't work, but actually taking a step back and doing the debrief and asking, what happened here? What do we give thanks for? Where did we see God's movement? And what didn't go as planned or as expected, and why? And what do we take from that for moving forward? And I think if we can claim that there's success if we learn something, and not just if it goes as planned, I think there's a lot to gain from that.
Scott, Karen, anything there?
I'm thinking about risk, when risk is beneficial and when risk is toxic. And
Oh.
mutual risk is almost always beneficial. Like the teams that I've been on where everybody was putting it all on the line and was exhausted at the end of the day were some of the most grace-filled, lovely, trust-building
Yeah.
teams.
Yeah.
We knew we had each other's back because the stakes
Yeah.
were too high.
Yeah.
And you were already grateful that this person was in this particular, firefight with you.
Mhm.
Um, and then risk that happens alone, like we well established church are totally fine. You plant that we are supporting, sort of, are going to
Mhm.
die. We're not troubled. You're troubled. That
Wow.
is like a breeding ground for resentment and pain on behalf of the leader, but also on behalf of the people in the new faith community who are
Yeah.
often vulnerable along other axes
Yep.
that the established community isn't. And so
Yeah.
I guess I'm thinking about how we meter out risk so that we're in it together.
Mm.
How we make that happen. I mean, I'm thinking of a student of ours who graduated, who's been with this community for 5 years now, 6 years maybe, and is having a community-wide conversation about whether or not he should be paid as their pastor anymore. And the only way that works is that they've shared life and finances and homes and deep, intense things together over years. And they know that nothing's going to happen to their community, whatever they decide here. And he knows that they're going to care for him no matter what happens to the community. Um, and it's a powerful thing to watch.
Interesting. Scott?
I think too, we need to recognize how much our current systems are set up to mitigate against the possibility that God might not do the thing that we want God to do.
Oh, man.
So I think that part of what how the risk conversation can change and go from scary to good, from possibly toxic to life-giving, is to reframe risk in the language of faith and in the recognition of God's preemptive, grace. And so the fact that God's mission is God's mission.
Mhm.
We are not going to be the only Jesus people ever meet. No, Bill Hybels, the church is not the hope of the world. Jesus Christ is. And so, I think so many of so much of the time we assume that we have to sustain the status quo at all costs because we're up to such a good thing, not realizing that it's God who has given us the work, and it's God who's going to bring the work to completion. And so I do think, I feel like this is a little bit of a dodge because it doesn't feel as practical as what Karen and Michael said, but I do think a theological imagination around risk is really important. And I think that's inspiring to people. We are a part of these communities because we believe God is a living being that is speaking, that is at work. That God is a subject at work in the world, and we can find our identity and our meaning and our hope in the life of God. And so, I think risk can help us reconnect with that a little bit as well.
Well, this is great. I wish we had more time to dive into that, Scott, but the whole theological aspect represents another fascinating avenue. But for the sake of time, let's take a quick break and we'll come back with some closing questions. Y'all good? My daughter's getting a snack, so let me wait for her to clear out. All right, we're back with Michael Gerling, Karen Rohr, and Scott Hagley we were talking about their book, Sustaining Grace, and some great conversation there. Really appreciate y'all's time and thoughts on this. So closing questions, you can take these as seriously or not as you like to. So we'll kind of go quick hit here. Michael, if you're Pope for a day, what do you want to do? What's that day look like?
Yeah, I think if I was Pope for a day, I'd want to wave my Pope magic wand. I'm assuming the Pope has a magic wand. I'm not Catholic. I don't know.
Sure.
But I'd want to rid the church of our idolatry of power. So often I see churches and sometimes church planters too wanting to do something new, and the assumption behind the new thing is we're going to start this new thing and our neighbors are going to come to it and be blessed by it. And the assumption behind that is, we're deciding what's going to happen. They're going to come to it and receive from us.
Mm-hmm.
And very very rarely, but it's a blessing when I do hear it. Do I hear churches wanting to instead go to their neighbors on their neighbors' turf and on their terms and get to know them in the places where they're already spending time,
Yeah,
and give up the power of being the ones who are calling the shots and owning whatever the thing is that is the gathering place.
that'd be a good one. Scott, how about you?
Hmm. I don't know how to answer this. I think I might just want to ride around on the Pope Mobile like Michael Bluth in Arrested Development.
I always tell people you can take these, like I said, as seriously or not as you'd like to. Karen, have you had any vast insights since I last asked you this question?
Oh, I mean, what I'm thinking is the Pope is the person who can speak for Christendom more loudly and clearly than anyone else. And so I think what I would want to say is like, I'm sorry. I mean, this is very Presbyterian, right? But like, I want to confess. I want to start naming things and repenting and having that conversation.
Love it. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life. Scott, you go.
So I saw this question, and I actually, where I went immediately is I think what I would want to do, rather than bring someone back to life, is to like to see what it would be like to live an ordinary life in one of these kind of transitional moments in history that we look back as transitional. So rather than like meeting John Calvin, what would it be like to be in Geneva during the Reformation, right?
Yeah.
Rather than, meeting Augustine, what would it be like to be living in North Africa in the fall of the Roman Empire, that kind of thing. So anyway, that's kind of where my imagination went. But because I think it's harder for me to like name one figure I'd want to bring back.
No, it's good. I like it. Michael, how about you?
Yeah, the first person I thought of was the Anglican poet Gerard Manley Hopkins.
Okay.
I just love his poetry. I think he helps me see the world in more beautiful ways, and to see beauty in places where I don't normally see it, and to see Christ in places where I don't normally look for Christ. And so I think I'd like to spend some time with him to help me see the world in more beautiful ways.
Awesome. Karen, anything you want to add here?
Last time I said Bayard Rustin, which I'm still interested in that. Like
Still
the strategic
interested,
mind, the Quaker
Okay.
practice, the being a gay man in that context. Yeah, I'd love to hear what he has to say.
Okay, let's go this way. Karen, you start, and if you don't want to add to your answer, we can pass to Michael. What do you think history will remember? Since we're technically in a new from when you last answered this question from this current time and place.
And Lauren, this is where our conversation got grim last time, and I'm going to do it again because I can't help myself. I don't see how history doesn't look back on this moment and say, like, wow, for the sake of selfishness, they let millions and millions of people die of a pandemic, and they just let global warming keep going because, like, I can't be asked to be inconvenienced. To me, the mark of right now is it is good. I mean, we talked about self-sufficiency, self-sustainability. Yeah. I think the problem is that we love to be isolated. For the sake of our loneliness, we will sell almost anything. And I don't see how that's not one of the main marks of our day.
Wow. That's pretty dark, pretty bleak. Michael, Scott, how about you?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like there's obvious answers to this. I mean, because of the pandemic that we're in still. But I also think about the fact that I don't think I ever learned about the Spanish flu until last year. And so I don't know that history is going to hang on to that. The other option I would throw out, though, is our relationship to nationalism in the church.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that history will look kindly on the church in the United States, or at least the white church in the United States.
Yeah. Scott?
I think they're going to say it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. I think my guess is that like there's probably all kinds of ways in which we're regularly missing the point. And, the stuff that I'm really mad about right now is not going to register. And there's a bunch of other things that are more devastating, are going to have more consequence in the future that I'm completely ignoring, that are going to be what historians are going to want to say about this time. So,
Hmm.
but I don't see how this is not a kind of transitional time. How this is
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
There's going to be some moment where it's clear what was actually happening and what was dying and what is being rebirthed and things like that.
Okay, Karen, give me something more hopeful here. I don't remember what you said last time, so bring me back here. Bring our listeners back.
Oh, I don't remember either. Yeah, I think I'm thinking about my hope for this era, and I think it is the places I've seen mutual aid and mutually shared risk bubbling up. People who are like, "This is hard. Things are hard. I want to be in this
Hmm.
with the people who are vulnerable, and we're going to be okay together." I think that's what's giving me hope.
Scott?
So Andrew Walls, a mission historian, has this way of framing mission history where Christianity has never been like a singular kind of expansive entity, but has this way of like flourishing and then dying in one region. Well, then it flourishes and dies in another region.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think like there's a lot of people pointing to the demographic shift in Christianity, and I think there's a lot to that, and in the sense that the center of gravity, the gravitational pull, is to the south, it's to the east, from where we are now, and so I think the future of Christianity in the United States, there's going to need to be a lot of repentance, a lot of disentangling from nationalism, from racism, and things like that. And so I think there's a long winter ahead of us, because this is sort of what has happened in other regions as well. I mean, this is just how in the history of Christianity this kind of thing happens. It doesn't mean it's dead in the United States. I just think it means that we have to undergo some pretty massive shifts, and we should be ready to embrace this as maybe sometimes in some ways in the white Protestant church, God's judgment, and then also God's invitation to a new way of being together.
That's good. That's good. Michael, how about you?
I'm thinking about someone who visited the church I had started one time for one of our gatherings, and it was on a Sunday where, for whatever was happening in the life of our world, it was probably near a holiday. A lot of our folks weren't there, and so we were very small in numbers that day. I think maybe half a dozen people, like really, really small. And afterwards, this person said, I grew up in a church where worship happened to me. I sat there and I watched it happen. And in this place, this is the first time where I ever felt like if I don't contribute something, and then church is not going to happen. And I felt like I had to make worship happen with you all.
Yeah.
It was one of the best compliments I ever received. But that's my vision, and what I hope for the church is that we would move away from this kind of consumer mentality where we can just experience worship or experience church for us, and instead be a community that's doing church together.
Yeah. Well, that's a good one. That's a good one. Well, Michael, Karen, Scott, really appreciate y'all's time. I know it was quite of a challenge for us to finally nail down this time, so I appreciate y'all's flexibility in making this happen. Michael, then Karen, then Scott, why don't y'all kind of tell where we can find out more about y'all?
Yeah, well, you can find out more about the work I'm doing and the broader 1001 New Worshiping Communities movement at the website 1001, spelled out, not the numbers, spelled out, 1001.org. And then if you want to get in touch with me and talk more about anything, my email is michael.gerling@pcusa.org, or you can find me on social media. My Instagram handle is Michael C. Gerling.
Awesome. Karen.
Excellent. You can find me on Twitter, although I do not do much on Twitter. The best way to reach me is email, krohrer@pts.edu. And our website has a ton of information about the Center for Adaptive and Innovative Ministry, the certificate program, which you can take from anywhere across the country, and of course our emphasis in the master's program, which helps to support people getting their MDivs doing this kind of work.
Yeah, Lauren, thanks for having us on. This was great. You can get a hold of me through email through my PTS email as well, shagley@pts.edu. I do have another book, Eat What Is Set Before You, with Urban Loft Publishers. It's a study of a congregation in a very dynamic urban context. And I think, like, we have a great missional leadership doctor of ministry program here. I see a lot of what I do. I have poorly maintained social media accounts. So a lot of what we do is try to cultivate learning communities apart from the social media sphere. So that we have got a missional leadership doctor of ministry program, as Karen said, the graduate certificate, and adaptive and innovative ministry are great places to connect. So.
Awesome. I remember this, Karen, when you were on, having a debate about what the real PTS seminary is, because I went to Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, PTS Tulsa, and there's another PTS I'm aware of. I don't know what state it was. That New Jersey? Where's Princeton?
It's in New Jersey.
New Jersey. So we'll, I think unfortunately my PTS is the least well-known PTS, but we're all trying to do some good work out there. So the book is Innovative Ecosystems for New Faith Communities. I imagine it's wherever books are sold, even on our friend Jeff Bezos' site. But the publisher's Whips and Stock, and publishers always help me out. So if you can buy it from the publisher, Jeff Bezos, he has plenty of money, right? As we're speaking, I think he safely landed from his journey to space. But Michael, Karen, Scott, thanks so much for your time, and may God's peace be with you.
So much.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren.